What happens when a queen is exiled by her own son? How can a family's art collection become a final act of defiance against empires? When does a woman's ambition become a threat to an entire city? The Medici women were not just wives and mothers. They were bankers, politicians, spy masters, and survivors. They operated in a world of immense wealth and constant danger. Their lives were filled with dramas that history often overlooks, focusing instead on the men. These are the stories from their courts, the personal conflicts, and public battles that shaped the destiny of Florence and Europe. They are stories of quiet rebellion, of lavish spending that hid political aims, and of family ties that were both a shield and a weapon. Number 20 was Catherine de' Medici, a queen or a spy master. Catherine de' Medici's court in France employed over 80 ladies in waiting. This was an unusually large number even for a queen. Her personal intelligence network was said to rival the Vatican's in its reach and efficiency. She consulted an astrologer, Cosimo Ruggieri, for decades, and his influence over her was a source of constant suspicion and rumor among her enemies. He was more than a mystic, he was a confidant and an information gatherer. Catherine de' Medici arrived in France in 1533 as a young bride for the future, King Henry II. She was an outsider, a merchant's daughter, in the eyes of the French nobility, despite her vast wealth and connection to a pope. They called her the Italian woman. They underestimated her. For years, she was overshadowed by her husband's powerful mistress, Diane de Poitiers. And Catherine was patient. She learned the intricate dance of the French court. She observed who had power, who wanted it, and who could be trusted. She learned that information was more valuable than gold. When her husband died in a jousting accident in 1559, Catherine's time began. She became regent for her young son, King Francis II. He died a year later. She then became regent for her second son, King Charles IX. She was no longer just the Italian woman. She was the ruler of France in all but name. This is when her real genius for politics emerged. She did not rule with armies, though she could command them. She ruled with information. Her large group of ladies in waiting was not just for show. They were her eyes and ears. They were beautiful, charming, and intelligent women from noble families across France. They attended every party, every hunt, every private dinner. They listened to the whispers of ambitious dukes and disgruntled courtiers. They gathered gossip, rumors of plots, and news of secret alliances. They reported everything back to Catherine. This group became known as her flying squadron. Her enemies claimed she used them to charm and manipulate powerful men to extract state secrets. The truth was likely more subtle. These women were loyal to Catherine. She had given them position and influence. In return, they gave her knowledge. In the treacherous world of the French court, knowledge was survival. Catherine also built a network of agents across Europe. They were not official spies. They were merchants, bankers, artists, and clergymen. Many were Florentines, loyal to the Medici name. They sent her coded letters with news from England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. She knew what her rivals were planning, often before their own advisors did. This allowed her to be one step ahead. She could counter a plot before it even started. She could arrange a marriage alliance to neutralize an enemy. She could send money to support a faction that would weaken a rival king. Her reliance on Cosimo Ruggieri was another layer of her power. To the court, he was a mysterious figure who read the stars. Catherine's enemies accused him of dark arts and claimed he was a corrupting influence. But Ruggieri was also an Italian who understood the subtle politics of his homeland. He was a discreet confidant who had no loyalty to the French nobility. He could give Catherine advice that was not colored by French factionalism, whether she truly believed in his predictions or simply used astrology as a cover for their political discussions is unknown. What is clear is that he was a key part of her inner circle. Their long association was a scandal in itself. A queen of France, depending on a foreign mystic, was seen as improper and dangerous. It fed the narrative of her as a manipulative Italian, using strange methods to hold on to power. Catherine's court was a web of secrets. She understood that a public display of power was not always the most effective way to rule. A whispered suggestion, a piece of well-placed information, a secret deal made in a private chamber, these were her tools. She ruled for 30 years, through the reigns of 3 of her sons. She navigated the brutal French wars of religion, a period of intense civil strife. She did it not just as a queen, but as a master of intelligence. The scandal was not one of grand betrayal, but of a quiet, persistent, and highly effective system of information gathering that gave an Italian woman ultimate control over the Kingdom of France. Number 19, did Bianca Capello bewitch a Grand Duke? Bianca Capello arrived in Florence as a fugitive. She was a Venetian noblewoman who had run away with a poor bank clerk, Pietro Bonaventure, in 1563. This act alone was a major scandal. Her powerful family in Venice was furious. They condemned her and wanted her returned. In Florence, she was an outcast, a disgraced woman living in a small house with her lover. Yet within a few years, she would become the most powerful woman in the city. The story of her rise began when she caught the eye of Francesco, I di Medici, the son of the ruling Grand Duke Cosimo. Francesco was married to Joanna of Austria, a politically important but reportedly plain and melancholic woman. Francesco became infatuated with Bianca. He showered her with gifts, gave her a villa, and made her a prominent figure at court. This was not unusual for a prince to have a favorite, but the relationship between Francesco and Bianca was different. It was intense and all-consuming. The Florentine court was shocked. Bianca was not just a mistress. She acted like a shadow duchess. She had influence over political appointments. People seeking favor from Francesco went to her first. She advised him on matters of state. The official Grand Duchess, Joanna, was isolated and ignored. This created a deep rift in the court. The nobility was forced to choose sides. Do they pay respects to the legitimate wife, the Habsburg princess, or to the Venetian favorite who clearly held the prince's heart and mind? The scandal deepened with accusations against Bianca. Her husband, Pietro, was given a job at court, but was later found dead in the street. Her enemies whispered that Bianca and Francesco had arranged it. There was no proof, but the suspicion lingered. And then came the accusations of witchcraft. How could this runaway from Venice have such a hold over the Grand Duke? People started to say she must have used potions and spells. Florence was a city that was, on the surface, devoutly religious, but it also had a deep undercurrent of belief in magic and the supernatural. The idea that Bianca had bewitched Francesco was an easy explanation for a situation that seemed unnatural and improper. It was a way to discredit her without directly attacking the prince. Bianca's position was precarious. She was entirely dependent on Francesco's favor. She knew she needed to secure her future. The key was to provide him with a son, something his wife Joanna had failed to do, having only produced daughters. In 1576, Bianca announced she had given birth to a boy, Antonio. This caused a sensation, but rumors immediately spread that the child was not hers. People claimed she had faked the pregnancy and smuggled in a baby from another woman. The scandal was so great that an investigation was ordered. The results were inconclusive, which only fueled more gossip. Francesco, however, publicly acknowledged the boy as his son. 2 years later, in 1578, Grand Duchess Joanna died. Just a few months after her death, Francesco secretly married Bianca. He made it official with a public wedding the following year. The fugitive from Venice was now the Grand Duchess of Tuscany. This was the ultimate scandal. It confirmed everyone's worst fears. The city was divided. Some admired her cleverness and determination. Others saw her as a wicked opportunist who had schemed her way to the top. The German relatives of the late Joanna were outraged. The court in Vienna viewed the marriage as an insult. Bianca and Francesco ruled together for nearly a decade. Their court was known for its interest in science and alchemy, which only added to Bianca's reputation as someone involved in mysterious arts. They were deeply devoted to each other, but they were also isolated. They had many enemies. The scandal of her rise never faded. It was a constant whisper in the halls of the Pitti Palace. Did she do it through charm and intelligence, or through something darker? The question of whether she bewitched the Grand Duke was never about real magic. It was about a woman who broke every rule of society and still managed to win the ultimate prize. Number 18. Why did Florence's people resent their duchess? Eleonora of Toledo spent over 22,000 florins on a single dress. That was more than the annual income of most wealthy Florentine merchant families. She purchased the Palazzo Pitti for 9,000 florins and then spent a fortune, over 60,000 florins, on its expansion and the creation of the Boboli Gardens. Her personal budget for jewels and fabrics was staggering, and it was paid for by the state treasury. When Eleonora of Toledo married Cosimo I di Medici in 1539, it was a major political victory for him. He was a new duke, his position still insecure. Eleonora was the daughter of the Spanish Viceroy of Naples, one of the most powerful men in Italy. The marriage brought Cosimo immense wealth, prestige, and a crucial alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles XV. She was beautiful, poised, and fertile, eventually giving Cosimo 11 children. On paper, she was the perfect duchess, but the people of Florence never warmed to her. In fact, many came to deeply resent her. The first problem was her foreignness. She was Spanish, and she never let anyone forget it. She maintained a rigidly formal Spanish court etiquette within the palace walls. Florentine society was traditionally more informal and accessible. The Medici, even as they became rulers, had always maintained a certain image as being first among citizens. Eleonora created a barrier between the ruling family and the people. The court became a separate, isolated world. She preferred to speak Spanish, and her closest confidants were from her Spanish entourage. This made the Florentine nobility feel like outsiders in their own city. Then there was the money. Eleonora's spending was legendary. She had a passion for luxury that was seen as un Florentine. The city was built on banking and commerce. Florentines appreciated wealth, but they also valued prudence and a certain level of public modesty. Eleonora's lavish lifestyle was seen as a flagrant display of absolutist power. She dressed in impossibly rich fabrics covered in pearls and diamonds. This was not just personal taste. It was a political statement. Her splendor was meant to project the power and stability of her husband's new ducal regime. But for the citizens who were being taxed to pay for it, it looked like extravagance. Her business dealings also caused resentment. Eleonora was intelligent and had a keen mind for finance. She invested her personal wealth shrewdly, buying up large tracts of land and getting involved in grain trading. She was very successful. Too successful, some thought. There were whispers that she used her position as duchess to her advantage, gaining inside information and manipulating markets. Whether true or not, the perception was that she was enriching herself at the expense of others. It blurred the line between the private wealth of the ruling family and the public finances of the state. Perhaps the biggest source of resentment was her physical withdrawal from the city. The Medici family had traditionally lived in the heart of Florence, in the Medici Palace on the Via Larga. It was a symbol of their connection to the city. Eleonora found the palace dark and cramped. She also worried about the health of her children in the crowded city center. She convinced Cosimo to buy the Palazzo Pitti on the other side of the Arno River. It was a move away from the people. The old palace was in the middle of public life. The new one was a fortress-like residence set apart and looking down on the city. It symbolized the new distance between the ruler and the ruled. Eleonora was a capable and effective partner to Cosimo. She acted as regent when he was away. She was a major patron of the arts, commissioning works that defined the era. But she was never loved. She was seen as proud, aloof, and obsessed with money and status. The scandal was not one of betrayal or crime. It was a scandal of culture clash. She tried to impose the rigid, aristocratic style of the Spanish court on a city that still saw itself as a republic at heart. The people of Florence saw her spending not as a reflection of their city's glory, but as the indulgence of a foreign princess who did not understand them. Number 17, did one woman's ambition topple a republic? Alfonsina Orsini brought 12 mules loaded with her dowry when she arrived in Florence. But she also brought with her the political ambition of a Roman baron. She once wrote a letter to the Pope complaining about Florentine officials, stating, "They are not used to having to do with those of our rank." She established a personal chancellery in her palace, effectively creating a parallel government office to handle her own political and business affairs. Alfonsina Orsini was a Roman noblewoman who married Piero de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, in 1488. Like her mother-in-law, Clarice Orsini, she was an outsider from Rome, and she never truly adapted to Florence. But unlike Clarice, who was merely unpopular, Alfonsina was a political force in her own right, and her actions had massive consequences. The period of her influence was a time of immense turmoil for Florence and the Medici family. The first major crisis came in 1494. When King Charles V of France invaded Italy, Alfonsina's husband Piero, who is now the head of the Medici family, made a series of disastrous political decisions. He surrendered key Florentine fortresses to the French without a fight. The city rose up in anger. The Medici were declared tyrants and exiled. The family palace was looted. Alfonsina, Piero, and their children had to flee for their lives. For the next 18 years, they lived in exile, mostly in Rome, relying on her family's connections. During this long exile, it was Alfonsina, not her weak-willed husband, who became the driving force behind the family's attempts to return to power. She was relentless. She lobbied popes and cardinals. She negotiated with foreign powers. She managed the remnants of the family's finances. She was determined that her son Lorenzo would one day rule Florence. Her ambition was not just for her family, it was personal. She believed in the right of the aristocracy to rule, a concept that was alien to the republican traditions of Florence. In 1512, with the help of a Spanish army, the Medici finally returned to Florence. The Republic was overthrown. But the Medici who returned were different. They were propped up by foreign soldiers and papal power. And Alfonsina was at the center of this new regime. Her son Lorenzo was made the de facto ruler of the city, but he was young and often absent. In his place, Alfonsina wielded enormous power. This is when the real scandal began. Alfonsina started to dismantle what was left of Florence's republican institutions. She meddled in elections. She pushed for her own supporters to get key government jobs. She ignored the traditional councils and made decisions unilaterally. She used her position to acquire property for her family and to settle old scores. Florentines were outraged. They had a long history of civic participation. They were used to having a say in their government. Alfonsina treated the city like a personal possession, a fiefdom to be managed as she saw fit. Her behavior was seen as Roman arrogance. She built a grand new palace and flouted laws about property construction that applied to everyone else. She famously told a group of citizens who came to petition her that they should be grateful the Medici did not build pigsties on the land where their homes once stood. This kind of contempt for the local people created deep and lasting resentment. The historian Francesco Guicciardini wrote that she was the main cause of the renewed hatred for the Medici. She was a convenient target. She was a woman, a foreigner, and she was undeniably acting like an autocrat. She was blamed for high taxes, for political corruption, and for the general sense that Florence had lost its freedom. In 1527, news reached Florence of the sack of Rome. The city's main protectors, the Medici, Pope Clement VII, and the foreign armies, were in disarray. The Florentine people seized the opportunity. Once again, they rose up and declared a republic. The Medici were exiled for a second time. Alfonsina had died a few years earlier, but her legacy of misrule was a key factor in this new popular uprising. Did one woman's ambition topple a republic? The situation was complex, of course, but Alfonsina Orsini's blatant disregard for Florentine traditions and her aggressive pursuit of absolute power for her family certainly played a major role. She alienated potential allies and fueled the Republican opposition. The scandal of her rule was a political one. It was the story of how a woman's Roman-style aristocratic ambition clashed with the city's proud Republican spirit, leading to years of instability, exile, and conflict. Number 16. How does a queen lose a kingdom to her own son? Marie de' Medici was declared regent of France on May 13, 1610. The very next day, her husband, King Henry IV, was assassinated. The timing was so convenient that it fueled whispers for centuries that she was somehow involved. She spent an astonishing 1 million livres on the coronation of her son, Luigi, a sum meant to solidify her own power, not his. In later years, she would lead two separate armed rebellions against her own son's government. Marie de' Medici, a daughter of the Florentine Grand Duke, became Queen of France when she married Henry IV in 1600. The marriage was a financial arrangement. Marie's massive dowry paid off many of the king's debts. For 10 years, she was queen, but Henry held the real power. She was known for her temper, her love of luxury, and her political arguments with her husband. Then, suddenly, he was gone and she was in charge. As regent for the young Louis CI, Marie was the most powerful person in France, but she was not a skilled politician. She relied heavily on a small circle of Italian advisors, particularly Concini and his wife Leonora Galigai. Concini was given the title of Marquis d'Ancre and became a Marshal of France. He and his wife amassed a huge fortune and wielded immense influence. The French nobility despised them. They saw them as greedy foreign upstarts who were manipulating the queen and looting the kingdom. Marie's policies were a reversal of her husband's. She allied France with Spain, the traditional enemy. She arranged for her son, Louis, to marry a Spanish princess, Anne of Austria. These moves were deeply unpopular with many powerful French nobles and Protestants. The court became a nest of plots and conspiracies. Marie's rule was weak and characterized by bribery and attempts to appease rebellious nobles with money and titles. As Louis Xi grew older, he began to resent his mother's control. He was the king, but she and Concini held all the power. He was a quiet, withdrawn young man, and his mother treated him like a child. In 1617, when Louis was 15, he participated in a palace coup. With the help of his own favorite, Charles d'Albert, Duke de Luynes, he ordered the arrest of Concini. And Concini resisted and was killed on the spot. His wife, Leonora, was later put on trial for witchcraft and executed. Marie was stunned. Her son had seized power in a single, decisive move. She was exiled from court and sent to live under guard in the Château de Blois. The scandal was immense. The king had overthrown his own mother's government, but Marie was not finished. In 1619, she escaped from Blois, climbing down a rope ladder in the middle of the night. She became the figurehead for a rebellion of discontented nobles against her son. This led to a short civil war, known as the War of the Mother and Son. Louis's army quickly defeated hers. Amazingly, a reconciliation was arranged, largely by a rising churchman named Richelieu, who had started his career in Marie's service. She was allowed to return to court. For a time, it seemed like mother and son could coexist, but Marie could not accept a secondary role. She saw Richelieu, who was now the king's chief minister, as her main rival. She plotted against him, trying to convince Louis to dismiss him. This led to the famous Day of Dupes in November 1630. Marie confronted Louis and demanded he choose between her and Richelieu. She thought she had won. The court believed Richelieu was finished, but Louis, in a private meeting, reaffirmed his trust in the cardinal. The next day, it was Marie who was ordered to leave. She was exiled again. This time, there would be no return. She spent the last 11 years of her life wandering through Europe, from the Spanish Netherlands to England to Germany, a queen without a country. She continued to plot against Richelieu, but her efforts were futile. She died in Cologne in 1642 in relative poverty. The scandal was not just one event, but a decade-long power struggle between a mother who could not let go of power and a son who had to seize it to become a true king. It was a family drama that played out on the national stage, leading to rebellion, exile, and a permanent bitter rift. Number 15. What happens when a wife disapproves of her husband's court? Clarice Orsini refused to meet with the humanist scholar Angelo Poliziano for months. He was her children's tutor, appointed by her husband Lorenzo the Magnificent. She eventually had him fired. She complained that he was teaching them too much about pagan myths, and not enough about the lives of the saints. Lorenzo was forced to give Poliziano a villa outside the city to continue his work, just to keep the peace in his own home. Clarice Orsini was not a typical Medici wife. She was chosen for her connections, not her compatibility with Florence. Her marriage to Lorenzo de' Medici in 1469 was a major strategic move. The Medici were bankers who had become the unofficial rulers of a republic. The Orsini were ancient Roman military nobility. The marriage was meant to elevate the Medici status and give them powerful allies outside of Florence. But it also brought a very different kind of woman into the heart of the Florentine Renaissance. Florence in the late 15th century was the center of humanism. Lorenzo's court was filled with poets, philosophers, and artists who celebrated classical Greek and Roman culture. They discussed Plato, translated ancient texts, and wrote poetry inspired by pagan mythology. This was the world Lorenzo loved. Clarice found it bewildering and improper. She was a deeply religious woman raised in the strict, formal, and pious environment of the Roman aristocracy. She saw the humanists in her husband's circle as frivolous, and possibly even heretical. She did not understand their jokes. She did not appreciate their obsession with pre-Christian culture. There was a fundamental clash of values. The scandal was not about infidelity or political plotting. It was a quiet, domestic scandal about a wife who was completely out of sync with her husband's world. The most famous example of this conflict was her relationship with Poliziano. He was one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, a close friend of Lorenzo's and a key figure in his intellectual circle. Lorenzo trusted him to educate his sons, Piero, Giovanni, the future Pope Leo X, and Giuliano. Clarice disagreed with his entire curriculum. She wanted the children to have a traditional religious education. She insisted they read the Psalter and learn scripture. Poliziano wanted to teach them Greek, Latin, history, and classical literature. Their letters reveal the tension. Poliziano wrote to Lorenzo complaining that Clarice was interfering with his work and changing his teaching schedule. He said she filled the children's heads with old wives' tales. Clarice, for her part, saw him as an arrogant scholar who was leading her sons away from the true faith. The conflict was not just about education, it was about the soul of the next generation of Medici. Would they be pious Christian princes, as she wanted, or worldly humanist rulers, as Lorenzo and his circle intended? Eventually, Clarice won the battle. She used her influence as the mother of the children to have Poliziano dismissed from the household in 1479. As Lorenzo had to find a different tutor, one more acceptable to his wife. This was a major humiliation for Poliziano and a sign of Clarice's power within the family. It also revealed the deep cultural divide within the Medici palace. Clarice's relationship with Lorenzo himself was often strained. He was a brilliant, charming, and complex man who wrote carnival songs and religious poetry with equal passion. She was straightforward, proud, and uncompromising in her beliefs. She did not fit in with the Florentine people, who found her haughty and reserved. They were used to Medici women like Lorenzo's mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who was a skilled diplomat and moved easily in Florentine society. Clarice remained an outsider. Her disapproval of Lorenzo's court was a constant source of friction. It created an awkwardness at the heart of the Medici regime. The First Lady of Florence did not approve of Florence's leading intellectuals. It was a scandal of incompatibility. It showed that even a powerful marriage alliance could not bridge the gap between the devout, aristocratic world of Rome and the innovative, humanistic world of the Florentine Renaissance. Clarice Orsini's personal beliefs became a quiet but persistent challenge to the very culture. Her husband was famous for championing. Number 14, could a woman outsmart the Borgias? And Caterina Sforza, when faced with a siege, stood on the fortress walls and dared her enemies. They had captured her children and threatened to harm them if she did not surrender. According to the chronicler Machiavelli, who was fascinated by her, she told them she had the means to make more children. She once sent a letter laced with a substance intended to make Pope Alexander VI Borgia ill. The plot was discovered, but it showed her audacity. She ruled her lands of Forli and Imola for over a decade, leading her own troops and making her own alliances. Caterina Sforza was not a Medici by birth, but she married into a junior branch of the family. Her life, however, was far too dramatic to be contained by any single family name. She was the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Milan, raised in a sophisticated but ruthless court. She was tough, intelligent, and completely fearless. She became known as the Tigress of Forli. Her first husband was Girolamo Riario, the Lord of Forli and Imola and a nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. He was assassinated in 1488 by rival families in Forli. The conspirators captured Caterina and her children. They thought they had won, but the castellan of the main fortress, the Rocca di Ravaldino, remained loyal to her. Caterina convinced her captors to let her enter the fortress, supposedly to persuade the castellan to surrender. She left her children behind as hostages. Once inside, she refused to come out. She raised the Medici banner and defied the assassins. When they threatened her children, she gave her famous defiant reply. It was a shocking act, but it worked. Her enemies were stunned by her ruthlessness. They were unable to take the fortress, and with the help of her allies, she soon regained control of the city and took her revenge on the conspirators. This single act established her reputation across Italy. For the next 12 years, she ruled her small state as regent for her young son. It was a dangerous time. Italy was a battleground for the ambitions of the Pope, the French, the Venetians, and the Florentines. Caterina navigated this treacherous landscape with skill. She remarried twice, both times for love and political alliance. Her third husband was Giovanni de' Medici, who was sent as an ambassador from Florence. Their marriage connected her formally to the main Medici line. They had a son who would grow up to be the famous condottiero or mercenary captain Giovanni dalle Bande Nere. Her greatest challenge came from the Borgia family. Pope Alexander VI was determined to carve out a kingdom in central Italy for his son Cesare Borgia. Caterina's lands were directly in their path. The Pope declared that Caterina's family had forfeited their right to rule Forli and Imola, and he sent Cesare with a powerful army backed by French troops to conquer them in 1499. Many rulers in the region surrendered to Cesare Borgia without a fight. He was known for his cruelty and his military skill. Caterina refused. She sent her children to safety in Florence and prepared to defend her cities. Imola fell quickly. But in Forli, she personally led the defense of the fortress. She held out for weeks against a massive bombardment by Borgia's cannons. The siege of the Rocca di Ravaldino became famous throughout Europe. A lone woman defying the most feared army in Italy was a remarkable story. Machiavelli praised her courage, even as he criticized some of her strategic decisions. In the end, the fortress was overwhelmed. Cesare's troops finally broke through the walls, and Caterina was taken prisoner. She was sent to Rome and held in the Castel Sant'Angelo. The Borgias paraded her through the streets. It was meant to be a humiliation, a symbol of their total victory. But even in defeat, Caterina was defiant. She never begged for mercy. After more than a year in prison, she was released, largely due to pressure from the French, and she retired to Florence to live out her days. Could she outsmart the Borgias? In the end, no. Their military power was too great. But the scandal of her resistance was her greatest victory. In an age when women were expected to be pawns in the political games of men, she refused to be a pawn. She chose to be a player. She ruled, she fought, and she faced down the most powerful family in Italy. Her defiance was a scandal to the established order. She proved that a woman could be as cunning, as brave, and as ruthless as any prince. Number 13. Did a princess create a court more brilliant than her father's? Isabel de' Medici had her own motto, "As I desire, so it is." This was a bold statement for a woman in the 16th century. She ran her own household at the Villa Baroncelli, separate from her husband, where she hosted artists, poets, and musicians. She was an accomplished musician and composer herself, and her private court was considered one of the most culturally vibrant in Italy, rivaling that of her father, Grand Duke Cosimo I. Isabella de' Medici was the favorite daughter of Cosimo I and Eleonora of Toledo. She was beautiful, intelligent, and spirited. From a young age, she was given an exceptional humanist education, and she moved with grace and confidence in the sophisticated world of the Florentine court. Her father adored her and allowed her a degree of freedom that was almost unheard of for a woman of her rank. She was married at age 16 to Paolo Giordano I Orsini, the Duke of Bracciano. It was a political match meant to strengthen the Medici ties to the powerful Roman Orsini clan. After the wedding, however, a highly unusual arrangement was made. Cosimo I insisted that Isabella remain in Florence. Her husband, whose duties were often in Rome, agreed. This meant that for most of her married life, Isabella lived independently. This independence was the source of the scandal. A married noblewoman was supposed to live in her husband's house under his authority. Isabella lived in Florence, acted as the first lady of the city after her mother's death, and managed her own affairs. She created her own court, a circle of intellectuals and artists who gathered around her. This was not just a social circle, it was a center of cultural production. She was not just a patron, she was a participant. She advised artists, she debated with poets, she composed music. Her Villa Baroncelli, just outside Florence, became a haven for creativity. It was a place where the strict formality of her father's Pitti Palace could be set aside. Her gatherings were famous for their elegance, wit, and artistic freedom. This was a direct challenge to the traditional role of a Medici woman. Women like her mother, Eleonora, had been patrons, but they operated within the formal structure of the ducal court. Isabella created her own separate sphere of influence. Her freedom also led to rumors, because she lived apart from her husband, and because her circle included many charming and talented men, there was endless gossip about her private life. Her close relationship with her husband's cousin, Troilo Orsini, was a particular source of speculation. In the rigid society of the time, a woman living with such freedom was automatically suspect. The scandal, in its essence, was her autonomy. She behaved like a male prince. She controlled her own finances, she chose her own companions, and she cultivated her own cultural agenda. This was threatening to the established social order. Her father's indulgence of her behavior was also part of the scandal. He allowed her to break the rules that bound other women. Her court was seen as more relaxed, more innovative, and more genuinely artistic than the increasingly rigid and formal court of the Grand Duke. Cosimo's court was about projecting power. Isabella's was about fostering creativity. Some historians argue that her circle represented the last flowering of the true spirit of the Florentine Renaissance before the Counter-Reformation brought a more somber and restrictive mood to Italy. Isabella de' Medici's life was a testament to her strong will and her father's affection. She crafted a life for herself that was outside the strict conventions of her time. The scandal was not an event, but a way of life. It was the continuous public performance of a woman's independence in a world that did not believe such a thing should exist. She lived by her motto, and in doing so, created a cultural legacy that was uniquely her own. Number 12. What is the cost of being the other woman's predecessor? Joanna of Austria was forced to live in the same palace as her husband's publicly acknowledged favorite, Bianca Capello. For official processions, the city of Florence would decorate the route to the palace and then also decorate the street where Bianca lived. Joanna once commissioned a painting of the story of Penelope, the famously faithful wife of Odysseus, a clear and public commentary on her own husband's infidelity. She died at the age of 30, after giving birth to her 8th child in 11 years. Joanna of Austria was born to be a queen. She was the youngest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I, a member of the powerful Habsburg dynasty. Her marriage to Francesco I de' Medici in 1565 was a huge diplomatic achievement for the Medici family. It connected them to the most important ruling house in Europe. Florence celebrated with extravagant festivities. The 18-year-old Joanna arrived as a symbol of the Medici's new international standing, but the reality of her life in Florence was miserable. She was a pawn in a political game, and she found herself in a city whose culture she did not understand, and in a marriage that was loveless from the start. Francesco was already deeply involved with Bianca Capello. He made no secret of his preference. The scandal was the public and official nature of this arrangement. It was one thing for a prince to have a mistress. It was another thing entirely for the mistress to be treated as a de facto wife, while the actual wife was systematically marginalized. Joanna was the Grand Duchess. She was the mother of the heir, though. Her only son was sickly and died young. She fulfilled her dynastic duty, producing a succession of daughters, one of whom, Marie, would become Queen of France. But she was given no respect. The court was a place of constant humiliation for her. Courtiers seeking favor with Francesco would pay more attention to Bianca than to Joanna. And Bianca was given a palace near the court, and Francesco spent most of his time there. Joanna was left alone in the vast, cold pity palace. She was a shy, serious, and devout woman. She did not have the charm or the political cunning to fight back effectively. Her only weapons were her piety and her quiet dignity. She complained to her brother, the emperor, in her letters. She wrote of her loneliness and her husband's neglect. The Habsburgs in Vienna were aware of the situation and were displeased, but there was little they could do without causing a major diplomatic incident. Joanna was trapped. Her presence in Florence was a constant, awkward reminder of Francesco's duty. Her pregnancies were a state concern, but she as a person was ignored. She represented the formal political reality of the Medici state, while Bianca represented Francesco's personal desires. The city was forced to navigate this bizarre dual power structure. The cost for Joanna was immense. She lived a life of isolation and sadness. Her health suffered from her many pregnancies and her emotional distress. She found solace in religion and in her children. But she could never escape the shadow of Bianca Capello. Her life was a public performance of the role of the wronged wife. Her death in 1578 was tragic. She fell down a flight of stairs while pregnant with her 8th child. The child was delivered by cesarean section, but died immediately. Joanna died the next day. Rumors, of course, swirled that she had been pushed, but there is no evidence to support this. What is clear is that her life was unhappy and stressful. Just 2 months after her funeral, Francesco married Bianca. It was the final insult, suggesting to many that he had simply been waiting for her to die. The cost of being the other woman's predecessor was a life of public honor and private misery, a slow erosion of her spirit in a court that refused to see her as anything more than a political necessity. Number 11. Was she a poet or a political power broker? Lucrezia Tornabuoni negotiated the marriage of her son Lorenzo the Magnificent to Clarice Orsini. She traveled to Rome herself to inspect the bride, writing detailed letters back to her husband about the girl's appearance and character. She ran the family's business interests at the spa town of Bagno a Morba, managing properties and investments. She used her personal network of friends and contacts to gather political intelligence for her husband and son, information that was often more reliable than that from official ambassadors. Lucrezia Tornabuoni was the mother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, but she was far more than that. She was a poet, a biblical scholar, a savvy businesswoman, and one of the most astute political operators of her time. In a society where women were excluded from formal power, Lucrezia created her own channels of influence. The scandal, if one could call it that, was the sheer scale of her informal power, which she wielded with quiet and undeniable effectiveness. Born into the Tornabuoni family, who were allies of the Medici, she married Piero de' Medici, son of Cosimo the Elder, in 1444. Her husband was intelligent but suffered from severe gout, which often left him bedridden. This meant that from early in her marriage, Lucrezia had to take on an unusually public and active role in family affairs. She was a published poet and a patron of the arts, but her real genius lay in politics and business. She understood that in Florence, these two things were deeply intertwined. She cultivated a vast network of connections. She was a friend of merchants, a confidant to nuns in powerful convents, and a correspondent with politicians. People from all walks of life came to her with petitions. They needed a loan, a tax break, a favorable judgment in a legal case, or a job for a relative. Lucrezia would listen, and if she thought the cause was worthy or politically useful, she would intervene on their behalf with her husband or, later, her son. This made her an incredibly powerful figure. She was the unofficial gateway to the Medici. Her patronage built a huge reserve of loyalty and obligation that was crucial to maintaining the family's grip on the city. This was a scandalous blurring of lines. She was using the influence of the state, which the Medici informally controlled, to grant personal favors. But this was precisely how the Medici system worked. It was a machine of patronage, and Lucrezia was one of its chief engineers. Her business activities were also remarkable. She managed several Medici properties and investments, showing a sharp head for figures. Her work at Bagno a Morba was a clear example. She bought and sold land, managed the spa's facilities, and handled the accounts. This was not simply a hobby, it was a significant contribution to the family's wealth at a time when the Medici Bank was starting to face difficulties. Her political role became even more important after her husband's death in 1469, when her 20-year-old son, Lorenzo, took over. She was his most trusted advisor. He relied on her judgment and her extensive information network. Her trip to Rome to find him a wife was a diplomatic mission. She was not just a mother looking for a daughter-in-law, she was a Medici agent assessing a potential political alliance. Her letters are models of clear-sighted analysis, weighing the political benefits of the Orsini connection against the cultural differences Clarice would bring. Lucrezia was a master of soft power. She did not make speeches in the city council. She did not lead armies. She operated behind the scenes through letters, conversations, and carefully cultivated relationships. She built the social and political infrastructure that allowed her son to shine as the Magnificent. The scandal was that this woman, who had no official title, wielded more real-world influence than most of the elected officials in the Florentine government. She showed that in the complex world of Renaissance Florence, power was not always found in the public square, but often in the private parlor of a very intelligent and well-connected woman. Number 10. How do you save a legacy when your family is gone? Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici died in 1743. She had no children. Her brother, the last Medici Grand Duke, had died without an heir in 1737. The great Medici dynasty, which had ruled Florence for 300 years, was extinct. The new rulers of Tuscany were the House of Lorraine, a foreign dynasty connected to the Austrian emperors. By law, all the private property of the Medici, including their unparalleled art collection, belonged to them. They could have sold it off to the highest bidder or moved it all to Vienna. The scandal of Anna Maria Luisa's life is a reverse scandal. It is the story of how she prevented the greatest act of cultural vandalism that could have befallen Florence. She used the last bit of power she had to ensure the Medici legacy would belong not to another dynasty, but to the world. Anna Maria Luisa was the last of her line. She had lived a long life, much of it as the Electress Palatine in Dusseldorf, the wife of the Elector of the Palatinate. She was a great patron of the arts there, but she returned to Florence after her husband's death. She spent her final years in the Pitti Palace watching her family fade into history. Her brother Gian Gastone was the last male Medici ruler. His reign was one of decline and decay. The great powers of Europe had already decided Tuscany's fate. Without a Medici heir, the Grand Duchy was a piece on their diplomatic chessboard. They decided it would go to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, the future Holy Roman Emperor. The Florentines had no say in the matter. Their independence was gone. As the last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa inherited the family's vast personal possessions. This included not just palaces and villas, but the contents of the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, the Medici family tombs, and countless other treasures. We are talking about Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Michelangelo's sculptures, works by Raphael Titian and Leonardo da Vinci. It was arguably the greatest collection of art ever assembled by one family. The new Lorraine rulers saw this as a massive financial asset. They were eager to get their hands on it. Everyone expected the collection to be broken up and scattered. Anna Maria Luisa knew this. She spent the final years of her life in careful and determined negotiation with the new Grand Dukes. She was an old woman, the last remnant of a dead dynasty, facing the representatives of the most powerful empire in Europe. But she had one thing: they needed legal title to the collection. In 1737, on the last day of October, she signed a legal document that would change history. It is known as the Patto di Famiglia, the Family Pact. In this document, she formally bequeathed the entire Medici art collection and properties to the new Grand Duchy of Tuscany. But there was a condition, a legally binding clause of immense importance. The collection could never be removed from Florence. It was given for the benefit of the public and to attract the curiosity of foreigners. This was an act of incredible foresight. She was turning a private family collection into a public trust. She ensured that the art that the Medici had commissioned and collected over centuries would remain in the city that had inspired it. She saved the soul of Florence. The scandal is how close it came to being lost. The Lorraine rulers were not happy with the restriction, but they had to agree to get the property. They signed the pact. Anna Maria Luisa had won her final and most important battle. When she died, she was not mourned with grand ceremonies. The new regime was in charge, but her final act was a masterpiece of legal and political maneuvering. It was a quiet, paper-based scandal. A woman with no army and no formal power used a legal document to defy the will of empires. She ensured that Florence would not become just another provincial city, but would remain a world capital of art. The Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and the other museums of Florence are her true monument. She did not just save a legacy, she gave it to the world. Number 9. Did she bankrupt France for parties? In Catherine de' Medici's festival at the Château de Chenonceau in 1577 featured a mock naval battle on the river, a massive fireworks display, and a banquet where the most beautiful women of the court served the guests with their hair unbound. The cost was estimated at over 100,000 livres. The annual revenue of a large French province might be 300,000 livres. She spent another 600,000 livres on the wedding festivities for Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre in 1572. The French state was already deeply in debt. Catherine de' Medici is often remembered as a dark, manipulative figure. But in her time, she was also known as one of the greatest producers of court festivals in European history. These were not just parties, they were massive, elaborate, and incredibly expensive theatrical productions designed for political purposes. The scandal was their sheer extravagance at a time of civil war and national bankruptcy. These festivals were known as magnificences. They could last for days and involved triumphal entries into cities, tournaments, ballets, musical performances, and fantastical allegorical shows. Catherine understood that power needed to be seen. In a country torn apart by the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, she used these spectacles to project an image of royal authority, peace, and reconciliation. A classic example was the festival she organized at Bayonne in 1565. It was a meeting between the French court and the Spanish court, led by Catherine's daughter Elizabeth, who was Queen of Spain. The official purpose was a family reunion. The real purpose was high-stakes diplomacy. To create an atmosphere of harmony, Catherine staged a series of incredible entertainments. There were tournaments where knights dressed as different virtues and vices. There was an outdoor ballet performed on a huge, moving float shaped like a whale. These events carried complex political messages, suggesting that under Medici-Valois rule, France could be a land of peace and cultural brilliance. But these displays cost a fortune. The materials were expensive silks, velvets, gold thread, exotic foods, and huge quantities of wax for candles. The artists were the best in the kingdom. Poets wrote the scripts, painters designed the sets, and composers wrote the music. Hundreds of craftsmen were employed for weeks to build the elaborate temporary structures. All of this was paid for by the royal treasury, which was already strained by constant warfare. Critics, and there were many, saw this as a scandalous waste of money. While the people of France were suffering from high taxes and the destruction of war, the court was indulging in fantasy. Protestant pamphleteers were particularly harsh. They portrayed Catherine as a decadent Italian, corrupting the French court with her extravagant and immoral entertainments. They pointed to the classical, often pagan themes of the festivals as evidence of her lack of true Christian piety. The 1572 wedding of her daughter Margaret to the Protestant leader Henry of Navarre was intended to be the ultimate festival of reconciliation. It was the most splendid event Paris had ever seen. But the celebration ended in disaster with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre just a few days later. This turned the memory of the festival sour. The money spent on celebrating a peace that proved to be a bloody illusion seemed like the ultimate folly. Did she bankrupt France for parties? Not single-handedly. The wars were the main cause of the state's financial problems. But her spending certainly did not help. It created a perception of a royal court that was detached from the reality of its people's suffering. The scandal was one of priorities. For Catherine, the political image created by these festivals was a necessary expense of rule. For her critics, it was proof of a wasteful and corrupt regime. It was a debate about what a monarchy should be: a source of spectacle and awe, or a responsible manager of the kingdom's resources. Catherine chose spectacle. Number 8. Can loyalty survive exile? When Cosimo de' Medici was exiled from Florence in 1433, his wife Contessina de' Bardi was placed under house arrest with her mother. All of the Medici bank's assets in Florence were frozen. She was allowed to see no one except her immediate family. Despite this, she managed to maintain a secret correspondence with Cosimo, sending him information and advice. She also worked tirelessly behind the scenes with Medici allies who remained in the city, helping to orchestrate the family's return to power just 1 year later. Contessina de' Bardi is one of the more overlooked Medici women. She lived in the shadow of her powerful husband, Cosimo the Elder, the man who truly established the family's political dynasty. But during the most severe crisis of his career, her strength and loyalty were essential to his survival. The scandal they faced was the ultimate one for a Florentine family, political disgrace and exile. Contessina came from the Bardi family, an old and respected banking family that had fallen on hard times. Her marriage to Cosimo de' Medici around 1415 was a strategic alliance. It connected the newly wealthy Medici to an older, more established noble lineage. By all accounts, their marriage was a strong and stable partnership. Contessina was known for her exceptional household management, her prudence, and her quiet dignity. For years, the Medici's power grew. Cosimo was the richest man in Florence, but he was careful to maintain the appearance of an ordinary citizen. However, rival families, particularly the Albizzi, grew fearful of his influence. In 1433, they managed to seize control of the government. They arrested Cosimo, accused him of treason, and put him on trial for his life. He was ultimately sentenced to exile rather than death. This was a disaster. For a Florentine, exile was a kind of civic death. The family's reputation was ruined. Their property was at risk. Their supporters were persecuted. This is where Contessina's character showed. While Cosimo was in prison, she rallied the family's friends and allies. She used her own family connections to plead for his life. She managed the immense stress and uncertainty with composure. When Cosimo was sent into exile in Venice, Contessina was not allowed to join him. She was kept in Florence, a hostage to ensure the family's good behavior. This was a period of intense pressure. She was isolated, watched, and under threat, but she did not break. She became the focal point of the Medici party that remained in the city. She maintained their morale. She secretly funneled funds to supporters. She acted as a vital link in the communication chain between Cosimo in Venice and his allies in Florence. The Albizzi government quickly proved to be incompetent. The city's economy suffered without the Medici bank. Public opinion began to shift. Cosimo's allies, encouraged by Contessina's steadfastness, worked to elect a pro-Medici government. In 1434, just 1 year after the exile began, the new government invited Cosimo to return. His return was a triumph. The Albizzi family was sent into exile in his place. From this point on, the Medici were the undisputed masters of Florence. Contessina's role in this turnaround is often forgotten, but her loyalty and political skill during that critical year were indispensable. She held the family and their political faction together when they could have easily fallen apart. The scandal of the Medici exile was a public spectacle of a great family's fall from grace. But the story of Contessina is one of a quiet, private victory. She proved that loyalty could not only survive exile, but could be the key to overcoming it. Her story shows that the strength of the Medici dynasty was not just in its money or its famous men, but also in its resilient and politically astute women. Number 7 was her marriage, a state secret. Francesco I de' Medici and Bianca Capello were married in a private ceremony on June 5, 1278. The Grand Duke's first wife had been dead for less than 2 months. No, foreign ambassadors were informed. The Florentine government was not officially notified. The marriage was kept a secret from the public and from Francesco's own family, particularly his powerful brother, Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici. The official public wedding did not take place for another year. The secret marriage of Francesco and Bianca is one of the great romantic and scandalous tales of the Medici court. It was the culmination of a love affair that had lasted for over a decade and had defied all conventions. But it was also a politically reckless act that created immense uncertainty and risked a major family feud. Francesco's first wife, Joanna of Austria, died in April 1578. The court was officially in mourning. The protocol demanded a lengthy period of grief and sobriety, but Francesco, who had been devoted to Bianca for years, could not wait. He was determined to make her his wife and Grand Duchess as soon as possible. He knew, however, that the move would be deeply unpopular. The Florentine nobility looked down on Bianca as a Venetian adventuress. The common people viewed her with suspicion. More importantly, Francesco's brother, Cardinal Ferdinando in Rome, despised her. He saw her as a corrupting influence and a threat to the stability of the Medici dynasty. He believed she was manipulating his brother for her own gain. A quick marriage would be seen as a sign of disrespect to the late Joanna and her powerful Habsburg relatives. It would also confirm Ferdinando's worst fears about Bianca's control over the Grand Duke, so Francesco chose secrecy. The wedding took place in the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government, but it was a clandestine affair. A few trusted witnesses were present. A sympathetic priest performed the ceremony. For the next several months, Bianca was officially the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, but almost no one knew it. This created a bizarre and unstable situation. How was the court to function? Who was the First Lady? Bianca began to assume more of the dignities of the role, but without the official title. This led to confusion and resentment. The secret eventually began to leak out, which only made the situation worse. It seemed like the Grand Duke was ashamed of his own wife. Francesco spent the next year trying to manage the political fallout. He sent ambassadors to the court of Venice to have them officially recognize Bianca as a dowager of the Republic, a special honor that would elevate her status. He negotiated with his brother Ferdinando, trying to win his acceptance. He tried to prepare the Florentine public for the news. Finally, in October 1579, more than a year after the secret ceremony, a magnificent public wedding was held. Bianca Capella was officially crowned as Grand Duchess. There were lavish parties and public celebrations. But the event could not erase the scandal of the secrecy that had preceded it. The secret marriage was a scandal because it showed a ruler prioritizing his personal desires over his public duty. It created a period of political limbo. It showed a lack of respect for diplomatic and courtly tradition. And it revealed a deep and dangerous rift within the Medici family itself, a rift between the ruling Grand Duke and his cardinal brother, the next in line to the throne. The marriage that began in secret would continue to be a source of tension and suspicion until the very end of Francesco and Bianca's lives. Number 6, did she buy her way into heaven? Eleonora of Toledo was a patron of the newly formed Jesuit order. She provided substantial funding for the construction of their first church in Florence. She endowed numerous convents and monasteries, often those with a strong connection to her Spanish heritage. Her private chapel in the Palazzo Vecchio, decorated by the artist Bronzino, is a masterpiece of Mannerist art filled with complex religious allegories. Her personal spending on religious charities and foundations ran into the tens of thousands of florins. Eleonora of Toledo, the wife of Cosimo I, is often remembered for her secular tastes, her love of luxury, her vast property investments, and her creation of the Boboli Gardens. But she was also a woman of deep and demonstrative piety. Her religious patronage was on a scale that rivaled her spending on jewels and palaces. This led some cynical Florentines to whisper that she was trying to balance her worldly extravagance with spiritual investments, essentially trying to buy her way into heaven. The reality is more complex. Eleonora's piety was genuine. She was raised in the devout atmosphere of the Spanish court at the height of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. For her, public acts of faith and charity were an essential duty for a ruler. Her patronage was a way to support the church, but it was also a political statement. By lavishly supporting religious orders, particularly new and energetic ones like the Jesuits, she was aligning the Medici Duchy firmly with the forces of Catholic reform and with the power of her native Spain. It was a way of demonstrating that Florence was a loyal and Orthodox Catholic state. This was important for her husband Cosimo, who needed the support of the Pope and the Spanish Emperor to legitimize his rule. Her projects were always grand. She did not just make small donations, she funded entire building projects. She took struggling convents under her protection and revitalized them with huge infusions of cash. This was a very public form of piety. It was meant to be seen. It was a way for the Duchess to project an image of virtue and spiritual authority. But it also existed alongside her famous love of luxury. This is what created the perceived contradiction. How could a woman who spent so much on a single dress also be a model of Christian charity? For some, it looked like hypocrisy. It seemed as if her religious donations were a way of offsetting or justifying her extravagant lifestyle. And it was a form of spiritual accounting: spend a fortune on worldly goods, then spend another fortune on the church to keep the ledger balanced. This view, while perhaps unfair, points to a central tension in the culture of the time. The Renaissance court was a place of both great worldliness and intense religiosity. Princes and princesses were expected to be magnificent, to display their wealth as a sign of their power. They were also expected to be pious Christians. Eleanora embodied this duality more than anyone. Her private chapel is a perfect example. It is a small, intimate space, but the decorations are incredibly rich and intellectually complex. It is a room for private devotion, but it is also a dazzling work of art designed to impress any visitor. It is both sacred and a status symbol. So, was she trying to buy her way into heaven? Probably not in such a simple way. Her faith was likely sincere, but her expression of that faith was inseparable from her role as a duchess. Her charity was also a political tool. Her patronage was also a form of self-promotion. The scandal was not that she was irreligious, but that her piety and her worldliness were so deeply and visibly intertwined that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Number 5. Can a mother's love become a political weapon? After her second exile, Marie de Medici encouraged her younger son Gaston, Duke of Orleans, to lead a major rebellion against his brother, King Medici and Cardinal Richelieu. She used her parental authority to command him to act, writing letters that were a mixture of motherly affection and political instruction. This rebellion failed, and Gaston was forced to flee the country. Marie also tried to use her daughters, the Queens of Spain and England and the Duchess of Savoy, as pawns in her international plots against Richelieu, urging them to pressure their husbands to act against France. The story of Marie de Medici is often focused on her direct conflict with her son, King Louis, but a deeper and perhaps more tragic scandal was how she weaponized her role as a mother, using her other children in her relentless quest to regain power. Her maternal love and her political ambition became dangerously entangled. Marie had 6 children who survived to adulthood. As queen and then regent, she had arranged magnificent marriages for them. Her eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was Queen of Spain. Her second daughter, Christine Marie, was Duchess of Savoy. Her youngest daughter, Henrietta Maria, was Queen of England. Her eldest son was King Louis. Her youngest son was Gaston, Duke of Orleans. She had placed her children on thrones across Europe. She then tried to use them as a network of allies in her personal war against her own son's government. The most dramatic case was with her youngest son, Gaston. He was charming, popular, but also restless and easily influenced. He was often the heir to the throne, as Louis was in poor health for many years and had no children for a long time. Gaston became the natural leader for all those who were discontented with the rule of the king and Richelieu. And his mother from her exile in Brussels was his chief encourager. She saw Gaston not just as her son, but as her instrument. She believed that if he could overthrow Richelieu, she could return to France and resume her position of influence. She bombarded him with letters, urging him to be strong, to raise an army, to challenge his brother's authority. She played on his sense of duty to her as his mother and on his own ambition. In 1632, she convinced him to launch a full-scale invasion of France with the backing of Spanish money. The invasion was a disaster. Gaston's army was defeated, and his main noble supporter was captured and executed. Gaston was forced to make a humiliating peace with his brother. Marie's attempts to use her daughters were more subtle, but just as real. She wrote to them constantly, complaining of the ill treatment she had received from Louis and Richelieu. She urged them to act as her advocates at their respective courts. She wanted the King of Spain, the King of England, and the Duke of Savoy to put diplomatic and even military pressure on France. This placed her daughters in an impossible position. They were queens and duchesses with a duty to their new countries and their husbands. But they were also daughters with a lingering sense of loyalty to their mother. Their courts became centers of intrigue, with pro-Marie and pro-Richelieu factions vying for influence. Marie's plotting created diplomatic tensions between France and its neighbors. The scandal was her complete inability to separate her personal grievances from the interests of the state and the well-being of her own children. And she was willing to plunge France into civil war and to create international conflict, all in the service of her own comeback. She turned family bonds into political conspiracies. In her mind, her children's first loyalty should be to her. She used the language of maternal love and affection to demand political and military action. It was a perversion of the maternal role, turning it into a tool of rebellion and intrigue, and it ultimately left her isolated, and her children caught between their duties as rulers and their loyalties as sons and daughters. Number 4, did she try to rule Florence like Rome? Alfonsina Orsini, during her son Lorenzo's rule of Florence, had a special legal exemption passed that allowed her, as a woman, to inherit property and pass it on, bypassing her male relatives. This was a Roman aristocratic practice, not a Florentine one. She famously had an entire street of houses demolished to build her new family palace, the Palazzo Medici, an act of autocratic power that shocked the city used to legal process. She used a network of spies and informants to monitor the activities of prominent Florentine families. The core of the scandal surrounding Alfonsina Orsini was her fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps disregard, of Florentine political culture. She was a product of the Roman aristocracy, a world of powerful, semi-independent clans who ruled their lands like feudal lords. She brought this mindset to Florence, a city that, even under Medici control, clung fiercely to the language and institutions of its republican past. When the Medici returned from exile in 1512, Florence was governed by Alfonsina's brother-in-law, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, soon to be Pope Leo X, and her younger brother-in-law, Giuliano. But they were often in Rome. Alfonsina, as the mother of the young Lorenzo, who was being groomed for leadership, became the Medici representative on the ground. She began to act not as the wife of a leading citizen, but as a ruling princess. Her style was completely alien to the Florentines. She was imperious and demanding. She expected deference. Florentine politics was based on consensus building, patronage, and maintaining the appearance of republican procedure. Alfonsina saw this as inefficient and messy. She preferred direct action. If she wanted something, she used the power of the Medici name to get it, ignoring the councils and committees that were supposed to govern the city. Her building project was a perfect example. Florentine property law was complex. To demolish a street required negotiations, buyouts, and legal permissions. Alfonsina simply had the buildings torn down. It was a raw display of power that said, the law does not apply to us. To the Florentines, who valued their legal traditions, this was a deeply offensive act of tyranny. She also centralized patronage. Traditionally, different families and guilds had their own networks of influence. Alfonsina tried to make all petitions and requests for favors pass through her. She created a personal chancellery, a sort of private government office, to handle this. This was an attempt to impose a Roman-style system where all power flows from the single ruling family onto a city with a long history of distributed power. Her use of informants was another Roman import. While the Medici had always kept an ear to the ground, Alfonsina's system was seen as more sinister and systematic. It created a climate of fear and suspicion that was at odds with Florence's more open, if often argumentative, political life. The scandal was not just what she did, but how she did it. It was a clash of political cultures. She was trying to turn Florence into a Roman-style principality overnight. She did not bother with the subtleties and pretenses that had allowed the earlier Medici to rule. She was open about her belief in aristocratic privilege. This confirmed the worst fears of the city's Republican faction. They saw her as a foreign tyrant who was destroying their traditions of liberty. Her behavior provided them with powerful propaganda and fueled the resentment that would lead to the Medici's second expulsion in 1527. She ruled Florence as if it were her personal property, and the city never forgave her for it. Number 3 were wives, the secret accountants. And Contessina de' Bardi personally managed the budget for the vast Medici household, a budget that was not separated from the funds of the Medici Bank. Lucrezia Tornabuoni reviewed the account books from the family's various business enterprises, including their alum mines and silk workshops. The correspondence of many Medici women contains detailed discussions of loans, property purchases, and the management of agricultural estates. Their personal expenses were logged in the same ledgers as international banking transactions. One of the greatest and quietest scandals of the Medici dynasty might be a financial one hidden in plain sight in their account books. The Medici women, while excluded from the official management of the bank, were deeply involved in the family's finances in a way that completely blurred the line between the domestic and the corporate. They were not just wives, they were essential cogs in the Medici financial machine. In the 15th century, there was no concept of a modern corporation with a separate legal identity. The Medici Bank was a family business. The family's household expenses, political spending, and business capital were all drawn from the same pool of money. The woman who ran the household was therefore in a position of considerable financial responsibility. Contessina de' Bardi, the wife of Cosimo the Elder, was a master of this role. The Medici Palace was not just a home. It was the headquarters of a political party and a multinational corporation. It hosted a constant stream of visitors, politicians, artists, business partners, and petitioners. Managing the logistics and finances of this operation was a huge task. Contessina's prudent management of the household budget directly impacted the bottom line of the bank. A florin saved on wine for a banquet was a florin that could be used for a loan or an investment. Lucrezia Tornabuoni, her daughter-in-law, was even more directly involved. Her husband Piero was often ill. Lucrezia stepped in not just as a political advisor, but as a business manager. She corresponded with the managers of Medici-owned properties and businesses. She understood the numbers. She knew which ventures were profitable and which were not. Her input into financial decisions was based on first-hand knowledge of the account books. This situation was a scandal for 2 reasons. First, it violated the social norms of the time. Women were not supposed to be involved in high finance. Their world was the home, but the Medici home was the center of a financial empire, so the women who ran it were, by necessity, involved in that empire. Their work was hidden, unacknowledged in the official histories of the bank, but it was crucial. Second, it created a massive and unaccountable gray area in the Medici finances. Were the lavish dresses bought by the women a personal expense or a business expense designed to project the family's power and creditworthiness? Was a loan to a friend arranged by a Medici wife a personal favor or a strategic investment in a political ally? There was no distinction. This blurring of lines was a source of the Medici's strength. It allowed them to use their personal wealth for political ends and their political influence for financial gain. But it was also a weakness. As the family became more like a dynasty, the women's spending could become a major drain on the state. Eleonora of Toledo's massive personal expenditures were paid for by the Tuscan treasury, a later and more formalized version of the same old problem. The secret accountants in the Medici Palace were the women. They were the chief financial officers of the domestic sphere, a sphere that was inextricably linked to the family's public power and wealth. Their story is a hidden scandal of finance, a tale of how unacknowledged female labor was fundamental to the success of the most famous bank in the Renaissance. Number 2 was marrying into Roman nobility a mistake. Clarice Orsini brought with her to Florence a retinue of 50 Roman nobles and attendants. Alfonsina Orsini tried to secure a cardinal's hat for her brother, a classic Roman power play that angered Florentine families who felt their own sons were more deserving. Both women showed a public piety that Florentines found ostentatious. Both were criticized for their pride and their failure to adopt the more restrained manners of Florentine society. They were the two great Orsini brides, and both were deeply unpopular. The Medici made two major marriage alliances with the Orsini family of Rome. The first was Lorenzo the Magnificent's marriage to Clarice Orsini in 1469. The second was his son Piero's marriage to Alfonsina Orsini in 1488. On paper, these were brilliant moves. The Orsini were a powerful, ancient military family with deep connections to the papacy. Marrying them was meant to give the Medici, a family of bankers, an injection of old-world aristocratic prestige, and a powerful ally in the treacherous politics of Rome. But the plan backfired. The repeated choice to marry Roman nobles created a recurring scandal of cultural alienation at the very heart of the Medici family. The problem was that the Orsini women were not just individuals, they were products of a completely different culture. Rome was a city of popes, cardinals, and feudal barons. Its society was hierarchical, formal, and militaristic. Florence was a city of merchants, bankers, and artisans. Its society, at least on the surface, was more egalitarian and valued civic participation. Clarice Orsini arrived in this world and never adjusted. She found the humanists in her husband's circle to be impious. She found the easygoing manners of the Florentines to be disrespectful. She maintained a Roman distance and formality, which the Florentines interpreted as arrogance. She was the wife of the city's most important man, but she remained a foreigner. Her unpopularity created a point of weakness for Lorenzo, a constant low-level domestic problem that sometimes spilled into public view, as with her feud with his friend Poliziano. A generation later, the Medici made the same choice again with Alfonsina. But Alfonsina was far more politically ambitious than Clarice. She didn't just fail to adapt to Florence. She actively tried to change it. She brought with her the Roman assumption that the ruling family was above the law. She engaged in the kind of blatant power brokering and nepotism that was standard practice in Rome, but deeply offensive to Florentine Republican sensibilities. The scandal was the Medici's repeated failure to understand this cultural gap, or their willingness to ignore it for the sake of political advantage. By bringing in these Roman brides, they were importing a style of aristocratic rule that was toxic to their relationship with the city. The Florentines saw these women as symbols of everything they feared. The Medici were becoming autocratic, arrogant, and out of touch with the city's traditions. The two Orsini wives became convenient scapegoats. It was easier to blame the foreign woman for the family's increasingly tyrannical behavior than to blame the Medici men themselves. But the women's behavior was a real problem. They created a sense of alienation between the ruling family and the people. The Medici palace, with a Roman mistress at its head, began to feel like an occupying court, not the home of the city's leading family. Was it a mistake? From a purely political perspective, the alliances brought some benefits in Roman politics. But for the stability of their rule in Florence, it was a recurring disaster. It introduced a foreign element into the heart of the family that created constant friction. The scandal of the Orsini brides was a lesson in how a prestigious marriage could be a political liability and how family ties could create, rather than solve, problems. Number 1. Why was Anna Maria Luisa's will her greatest act of defiance? The Family Pact of 1737 was not a will in the traditional sense. It was a bilateral legal agreement between Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici as the heir to the family's private property and Francis Stephen of Lorraine, the new Grand Duke of Tuscany. This made it a binding international treaty, not just a personal bequest. The pact explicitly stated that no part of the collection could be taken away or transported out of the capital on the Grand Ducal state. This clause was a direct challenge to the standard practice of the time, where a new dynasty would absorb the treasures of its predecessor. The final act of the last Medici was not a surrender. It was a carefully planned and brilliantly executed act of legal defiance. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici's family pact is often seen as a generous gift, but it is better understood as a preemptive strike against the cultural erasure of her family and her city. The scandal it prevented was so enormous that its prevention became a scandal in itself, a scandal of defiance against the norms of 18th century European power politics. To understand the audacity of the pact, one must understand the context. The Medici were gone. Florence was no longer an independent player. It was a prize to be traded among the great powers. The new ruler, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, was the husband of Maria Theresa of Austria. He had little personal interest in Tuscany and would spend most of his time in Vienna. For him and the Habsburg Empire he represented, Tuscany was a resource. Its assets, including its art, were there to be exploited. The standard procedure in such a transfer of power was for the new dynasty to take possession of all the assets of the old one. The Great Farnese art collection had been moved from Parma to Naples when that family line died out. It was fully expected that the Medici treasures would be packed up and shipped to Vienna to adorn the imperial palaces. This would have been a catastrophic loss for Florence, reducing it to a cultural backwater. Anna Maria Luisa saw this coming. She was the last of her line, an elderly woman in a palace that no longer belonged to her family. She had no army, no political party. All she had was her legal title as the inheritor of the Medici's allodial property, their private possessions. And she used it with the precision of a master strategist. The family pact was her weapon. By framing the transfer as a pact, an agreement between two parties, rather than a simple inheritance, she created a set of binding conditions. The key condition was inalienability. The art could not be sold. And the second key condition was that it could not be moved. This was a radical idea. It tied the art not to a family, but to a place. She was effectively saying to the new rulers, you can govern this land. You can collect its taxes, but you cannot touch its soul. Its cultural heritage does not belong to you. It belongs to the city of Florence and to the world. This was an act of profound defiance. It was a rejection of the idea that art was simply the private property of princes to be moved and sold like furniture. The scandal was that she got away with it. The Lorraine dukes could have contested it. They could have found legal loopholes. But the pact was skillfully drafted, and to break it would have created a major public relations disaster. They would have been seen as cultural barbarians. So they agreed. Anna Maria Luisa's final act was the most Medici act of all. It was not done with swords, but with a pen. It was a victory achieved through legal cunning and a deep understanding of legacy. She knew the Medici dynasty was over. But with this single document, she ensured that the the idea of Florence as a cradle of art and culture, would be permanent. It was her last, greatest, and most successful political maneuver.